The one and only, thank God.
We're here today with Tedddy Roe in his home here in Billings, here on April Fool's Day, April 1, 2014. And we've already had quite a discussion, fascinating with Teddy, off-camera discussions about so many things. It's been a wonderful conversation covering a broad range of topics, for sure. And Teddy was in Washington, D.C. for many, many years. His legislative administrator, whatever term I should properly use, I'm going to let Teddy tell me about that, for Senators Mansfield and Senator Lee Metcalf. And I think I'll just let Teddy do the basic introduction as far as his background, his history with his various academic achievements at the University of Montana, Georgetown University, and at Johns Hopkins. But I'm going to just start off and let Teddy talk about his the standard introductory comments about his background.
Okay. I will try to keep it short, but this is such a personal story of how I got to Washington, D.C. and got to participate in the political side of creating the Wilderness Act and then the follow-through, helping to fend off all kinds of attacks by people who opposed it in the first place. I was actually born in Nebraska, came here as a child to Billings, Montana. I was a Depression-era kid, grew up on a farm with no electricity, cold running water, colder than the devil in the winter and hotter than heck in the summer as those Mexican, Texas, Kansas winds blew up from the south. But it wasn't all that much better in Montana in the beginning, because 9 of us lived in a single room on South 24th Street in Billings. I came from a family that had never been to college. I knew in my heart that I would eventually get there, but I had a couple of good influences along the way. Perhaps the best was I got a job at about age 14, perhaps, with Connolly Saddlery, which was a well-known name in Billings until the last few years. The Connolly family catered to the cowboys, the ranchers, the rural folk, and in addition to being taken into the family itself, etc., they followed what I did in school. They cared about my grades. They fussed over me. There was a young saddle maker there from Colorado. His first name was Dwayne, but he was known as Ranny, R-A-N-N-Y, which is another word for a cowpoke. Last name Florea, F-L-O-R-E-A. Ranny was an inveterate fisherman. He just loved to fish, so every weekend for a couple of summers, he would put me in the car, I would take my inadequate equipment, he would take his brand new spinning rod, and we would head west out of Billings, up into the Beartooths.
Wow.
And so I was exposed to many, many acres of that magnificent area, all the way to the Yellowstone Park. And the Hell-Roaring Plateau being probably the most frequently watched. Many years later, I was involved in the creation of the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness, and of course it all came home. The experiences were wonderful, but there was nothing in my history or even in my future that would suggest that I would come back and come to grips with wilderness. So I continued on to a couple of years of college at then Eastern Montana College, now MSU Billings. Got drafted into the Army, came back, went to the University of Montana, and majored in journalism. My senior paper was written, once again coincidentally, on the proposed Wilderness Act. I studied what was before Congress, what the arguments were, etc. Agreed with the general thesis that we should have a Wilderness Act.
What year was that?
I graduated from Missoula in 1959, so it might have been, a few months before. Might have been in 58, but 58, 59. So once again, I was introduced to wilderness, but again, no hint that I would be deeply involved with the subject matter. I go from there into newspaper work, worked for the Great Falls Tribune as a reporter, photographer, later as a young editorial writer for the newspaper second only to the New York Times for Pulitzer Prizes. My boss had just won a Pulitzer Prize, and he was a hard taskmaster, a great thing. I picked up a grant, went to South America, based in Argentina, came back, picked up another grant, went to Washington, D.C. on a congressional fellowship back in the days when they really were rare. It was American Political Science Association, Ford Foundation money. Half a year in the House office of your choice, half a year in the Senate. In the Senate, I worked for Mike Mansfield, then Majority Leader of the United States Senate, from Montana, with an extraordinary past of his own. And at the end of the fellowship, he offered me a job. I said no twice because I really wanted to go back overseas, but he sweetened the pot by saying I could go to school, which I did. I went to Georgetown for an MA in Russian area studies. But I was working for him for 10 years, virtually all of that time on the Senate floor. 2 of those years I ran the Senate floor as a staffer. And I was privileged to be there when some landmark legislation went through, including the Wilderness Act. I remember it like it was yesterday, listening to people like Hubert Humphrey and Lee Metcalf of Montana and other people who made it possible to get the act through. So once again, I had a brush with wilderness, but that's where it stood. I'd gotten to know Lee Metcalf because he was a cherished presider over the Senate for the majority leader. Lee Metcalf was a former Supreme Court of Montana justice, and so he was very dependable in the chair. But I left Mansfield. I went back to school. I stayed in foreign policy. Got a doctorate from School of Advanced International Studies, which is a Johns Hopkins, Washington, D.C. based school. And while I was looking around to figure out what the next step was, to write the dissertation, etc., I get a call out of the blue from Lee Metcalf, from his office. It turns out that his longtime legislative director, Vic Reinemer of Circle, Montana, was moving over to be the staff director for a new subcommittee that Lee had inherited, and that he needed a legislative director. I'll always remember the opening conversation with Lee. I went in figuring that, like anybody else that is an applicant for a job, he would be grilling me about certain things. He led off the conversation by saying, "Now I want you to remember, you work for me." And I thought, well, gee, who else would I be working for? And then he said, "And remember also that I work for you. That anytime you need you need me to call a secretary in the cabinet or an assistant secretary or whatever, you let me know and I'll do it." And he was true to his word. I worked for him for 5 years. They were the 5 best years of my professional life. He was such a good person. He stood for something. He stood for the right things. But it was not an easy task because, again, my association with wilderness and environmentalism and preservation had been fleeting, as I have related. And I felt like I had been parachuted into a war zone. As soon as I took my place at the desk, these were the days when back up just a little bit, but the Eisenhower administration was a pro-business administration. All of the boys that had come back from the war were having families, they needed housing, the big paper companies and the big logging companies were being given fairly lucrative permission to go into our national forest, including in Montana. They went in with such a vengeance that they were causing all kinds of backlash. They were clear-cutting within sight of the highway so people could get all stirred up. Out of that turmoil, the Montana Wilderness Association was founded. It was precisely to fight that sort of thing. And in coming to Lee Metcalf, they found the best champion of wilderness they could possibly find. Lee had served several years in the House of Representatives. First, he was a sponsor of the first wilderness bill in the House of Representatives. He came there at a time of ferment when the post-war people were trying to break the hold of basically of Southerners, conservatives controlling the Congress. The liberal forces formed what they called the Democratic Study Group. They made Lee Metcalf the first president. And he had such stature that many people, including good political scientists, the New York Times and others, said that that man will be Speaker of the House someday. This is an aside, but the truth is that Lee, in his later years, said that the only thing that he ever regretted was moving to the Senate, because he thinks he would have been Speaker. I think he would have been as well. Once in the Senate, this man, who was a natural leader, was precluded from having any kind of leadership position because the rules state that you can't have two senators from the same state in the leadership. That's what the party said. So Mike Mansfield was the longest running majority leader of in all time.
13 years, I believe it was.
But he and Lee Metcalf made a terrific partnership, because what Montana public didn't know then really doesn't know now, and the press, which was basically a corporate press in Montana, wasn't particularly interested in, is that Lee Metcalf was the senator from Montana. Mike's job was so all-encompassing with international and national events that he took Lee's lead in everything. So if Lee said, Mike, I'm going to put in this wilderness bill, etc., Mike says, sure, never ever questioned it. So what we had was an incredibly powerful twosome who could, move wilderness in Montana. But as I say, that's in hindsight I can see that, but I still go back to my statement that when I reached my desk for the first time, I was dealing with a subject matter that was not very familiar to me. I was dealing with people in Montana that I knew I would like but didn't really know. Everybody from at that time would be Doris Milner and Bill Cunningham, and people who were stalwarts that everybody in wilderness Montana know. And as I say, I just parachuted to my desk, and here it came. The lobbyists from the timber companies, everybody descending. Were it not for the kind of gentle handling and guidance that I got from Doris Milner and others in Montana, I would not have been a very good staffer. I want to say something very immodest here, though, and that is I was a good staffer. I understood the institutions really well. I understood how to get things done. I was a fairly fast learner, so I think that between myself and Lee and the people who would make regular pilgrimages back to Washington, D.C., we got the most out of our effort. There was another institution, again not known to Montanans or not known to the press back here, And that was when I went into Lee's office, where Lee made the policy for Montana, especially on preservation. There was a institution called the Good Government Group, which is pretty aptly named. I came into that position, it was already in place, but the so-called Good Government Group stemmed from Mike Mansfield's penchant for bringing everybody together. I mean, he was just superb at that. And one of the things that he instituted was regular meetings when he first came to Washington, D.C. as the junior congressman between the two senators and the other congressman from Montana. But eventually that devolved into a staff meeting whereby Mansfield would get the meeting room, which were hard to come by. Ray Dockstader, his administrative assistant, would be nominally in charge, but I, as legislative director for Lee, was really running that particular show. We would have staffers come from the two House offices into this group, and we would discuss what Montana needed, especially in the appropriations process. So that way I got to know staffers in a variety of congressional offices, whether it would be John Melcher or we had golly, the name is escaping now, but a Republican congressman for 2 terms from Missoula. We all worked toward the same goal. So not only did we have a powerful twosome in Mansfield and Metcalf, but we also had the added power of a foursome. Except, and here I have to get into personalities, occasionally we had House members who were not all that cooperative. And I will just step right out and say that John Melcher was the least cooperative of anybody that we ever had on the House side. Didn't really want to send his people to the meeting even. And his name will pop up in further conversation here. The other was Max Bacchus, and Max was cooperative to a point, but he was nervous. Despite the fact that he came out of western Montana, where both Lee and Mike came, they understood the constituency really well. If he were to do a Mansfield-Metcalf policy, support something, he was always safe. But Max didn't feel that he was safe. He also had very, very young staffers, some of whom went on in other elements to be really good Washington, D.C. bureaucrats or congressional staff. But this was another institution that was highly effective. We got on the same page as far as appropriations went, and I think maybe I will ask my moderator here to guide where he wants to go from here. Okay. I've now established the fact that I'm in the office. I'm surrounded by more and more familiar elements. I'm getting to know the people in the Montana Wilderness Association, and I will say this, that whenever something came up in Washington, D.C., and we'd have a hearing or some reason to have an MWA presence, there were 2 modes of transportation. The professional lobbyists, including the Montana logger representative, would come back and stay at one of the finer hotels in Billings. The MWA would resort to practically bake sales at times to get enough money to come back. And a generation of them slept on my floor or on my couch or in my guest room, etc. They came and went. So I got to know quite a few people that way.
Like Bill Cunningham.
Like Bill Cunningham, whom I revere as a friend, and will say unequivocally that of all of the people that I have seen lobbying Montana issues before the Congress, was the best.
And after all of his years of backpacking, sleeping on the ground in tent, probably sleeping on your floor was a delight. It was a luxury.
Yeah, the carpeting, I'm sure, was a luxury for Bill.
So I really like biographies, and I'm really fascinated by people in formative years. And So some of the questions I'll ask here are biographical in nature. One of the first ones, because we are talking about wilderness here as part of the topic, I ask you, what does wilderness mean to you? Growing up in Montana, you're in the shadow of the Beartooth, in the historical Beartooth Wilderness. What does it mean to you emotionally, spiritually, and in any other ways that you would like to describe? Personally, going back to your childhood.
I grew up on a dirt farm. I grew up on the plains. I still have a soft spot in my heart for, say, eastern Montana. I see beauty when other people don't, especially if it's green, but it doesn't have to be. I lament the passing of a short grass prairie where you can see wildlife at every turn. It's been either grazed into the ground or, well, that's mainly a big problem. But there was something special about the wilderness west of Billings and up into the Beartooths because it was so novel. I mean, I was poor enough that I didn't have a car. There's no way for me ever gotten outside of the city. So my life simply would not have gone where it went, I don't think, without that exposure to the foothills and to the mountains. The obvious answer are the right answers. That is the solitude, the peace, the quiet, even the green. I'm enough of an evolutionist to believe that we were shaped by the environment. The environment was, for the most part, it was a natural environment, and it was probably green. There's something restful about the color. So I think I captured early on that wilderness was a place for people to come for therapy. And now, of course, it's a common practice. There are psychiatrists, a lot of studies that show that people exposed long enough to the quiet and the solitude of wilderness will work out their own problems often. And if not, at least they'll be helped by it. We see that with the returning Iraq War veterans and some very powerful programs here in Montana to do it. So to me, it's hopefully, I mean, I believe in the words of the Wilderness Act. I'm not sure if I believe that with the constant growing of population and other, we can sustain these islands, no matter how large they are, without some sort of compromise. The compromise would have to be a legislative, congressional compromise, which I would sure hate to see. But as long as we have them, I answered lots and lots and lots of mail for Lee Metcalf, and we would get the kinds of letters from people who were expressing what I already believed. You might get a letter from New Jersey or somebody else applauding his support for wilderness areas. They might say, look, I'm a senior citizen, I'm not in very good condition, I know I'll never get to visit that particular wilderness in Montana or elsewhere, but I know it's there. Just knowing it's there is enough for me.
For future generations.
That's right. If I don't get there, my kids will, my great-grandchildren, great-grandchildren will make it. So it means a lot to me, and it was, for me, a labor of love throughout, and they were wild times. I'm talking about, so anywhere from 12 to 14-hour days if necessary. And the experiment was cut short by the untimely death of Lee Metcalf at age 66 from bad heart and other things, other ailments that he had. But he's somebody who was never really appreciated by Montanans. I don't think that he was appreciated by one generation further in of the Montana Wilderness Association to the extent that he should have been. And that when you start taking for granted that which is done. Here's a man who was the patron saint of virtually every acre of 4 million acres of Montana wilderness, who has had to be revived in the last year with the 25th anniversary of a wilderness area named after him. But when I came back to Montana in 1996 and joined the Eastern Wildlands chapter, the Billings chapter of the MWA, I attempted to get the MWA interested in honoring Lee on the anniversary of his own death. I really could not get anywhere because enough time had passed with him gone from the scene that the appreciation just was not there. It's starting to come back now. People are understanding that he not only was a champion of wilderness, but he was a champion of open government, of honesty, of taking a strong stand and letting the chips fall where they might. Something that you just cannot find today. I won't say cannot find. We have one good senator now who follows in that mold, and perhaps another one will follow him.
Mm-hmm. The Summer of Lee Festival last summer in the Bozeman area, I think that was altogether fitting, probably as you touch on, overdue. And that was a good thing to have in honor of.
Yes, it was. I enjoyed that. One of the things that I'm not particularly comfortable with in an interview like this is dealing with personalities, but personalities do affect outcomes.
And they make things interesting. They make history.
They do, and
raisins in the muffin, I like to.
There you go. So it's not my point here to impugn the integrity of any individual, but you have to recognize that we live in a state in which the press has been a fleeting factor. Anything from negative to neutral, pretty much, about anything. And we could do in Washington, D.C., pretty much what they do in Washington, D.C. right now, is anything that we want, and there is no coverage. There's nobody watching it, so members can, if they wish, say one thing and do another. And the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Lee Metcalf Wilderness near Bozeman is a case study in this. I spent more time working on a lot of time working on wilderness, but more than any on the what we call the S393 areas, 2.5 Congresses of it. Lee put in, well, one of the very first things that happened to me as I'm sitting at my desk was Cliff Merritt, a long-time staunch MWA, great personality, came in and said, the senator's got to help us. We're being bowled over, we're losing area after area, etc. So I said, okay, you go back, talk to your people, and put together a list of your priorities. He did. He came back and he had a list of 20 areas in Montana that were championed by MWA, and if we lose these, we lose a lot. I go to Lee later, and we sit down, and Lee said, politically, I cannot move this many pieces. So cut it in half, we'll take the top 10, and we'll take it from there.
The Montana Wilderness Study Act.
Right, so the Montana Wilderness Association made the choice. Doris Milner was president then. Made the choice of the top 10. It became the Montana Wilderness Study Act. The wording of that act was very careful. Cliff, I'm quite sure, is the one who put this in. And it said that these areas will be studied for their wilderness qualities, and until such time as Congress decides one way or the other, they shall be maintained for their wilderness qualities. When the bill went to the House side, it ended up in the subcommittee on public lands of the House Interior Committee, which happened to have as its chairman at the time Congressman John Melcher. John Melcher was no friend of wilderness, but would never ever tell the Montana public that. And we could not, we meaning Mansfield Metcalf, could not pass a bill over there that he did not try to make a change in. He basically was a flatlander from Iowa and South Dakota. He came and he made his fortune in Montana as a veterinarian in flatland Forsyth, east of Billings. The mountains were not part of his psyche. They really were not. I will not say exactly why he did what he did, but there's a little wilderness in Montana called Pilgrim Creek. He sat on that and he held it up. And don't ask me to remember precise amounts for decades back, but I'm going to say it's somewhere in the vicinity of 40,000 acres. He came up with a scheme whereby he would cut it in half. The environmentalists would get the upper half, in other words the rocks and the ice, and the loggers would get the bottom half. This is the sort of thing we ran into all the time. When S393, the Montana Wilderness Study Act, got to his subcommittee, he mysteriously let the thing go through. It had a lot of support in Montana, etc. But what he did not know, and what his staffers did not catch for him, was that these are in essence wilderness areas until Congress decides otherwise. Once he discovered it, it was too late. The bill had come back out of the House, and we readied it for sending on to the president. And he was really upset about that. And one of the areas was the porcupine buffalo horn, highlight porcupine buffalo horn area,
Still going on.
south of or near Bozeman. A very complex area, but one that contained the Gallatin Range. It was skillfully put together by MWA people to meet the requirement. John Melcher, who I will say in his heart of hearts never liked wilderness, when he became senator, he revisited the issue because the same people in Montana were going back and making the same arguments to him that they made to Lee Metcalf. But they never really got anywhere. At one point, John Melcher said, in effect, okay, we will have a wilderness there, and in effect, I will draw the boundaries. I think MWA proposed the name Lee Metcalf, but Lee Metcalf was so self-effacing, like Mansfield, he would never in a million years permit his name to be attached, especially the one that was redrawn. The lines, the new lines for that particular 393 area were bastardized. The Gallatin Range, which was key to it, running on into Yellowstone Park, was removed. But it was passed, and it's caused a division in the MWA today that is very unfortunate. That the original supporters of the total area have lived with this fracturing, and bad feelings have developed, and it is sad.
We went from 400,000 acres to ultimately 250,000
Right.
acres.
And it's not something Lee Metcalf would have approved of.
Wow. So, how about, you mentioned this already a little bit, would you describe your connections with the Montana Wilderness Association?
The job was the times were so frantic, and the abuses so great, and the work within the Congress were so great that even though I had the ability to take off and go to Montana for inspection tours and do what I want, I really could not in good conscience absent myself. So my dealings with the Montana Wilderness Association were basically through those emissaries who came back to Washington, D.C. I tried to come out for a couple of conventions. I tried to get to know and talk to the successive presidents of the MWA, but mainly the relationship of the MWA was with Lee Metcalf. I mean, he was their hero. They worshipped him. They would have walked off cliffs for him. And this is no exaggeration. I'm sure that in your interviewing of people who've been around long enough to remember Lee will tell you the same thing. But my relationship with it was a good one because I represented the man that they worshipped and they followed, and when he would go to the state, they would get their chance to see him. And of course, when people from Montana came back to see him, they always got to see him. There was never a question of, I'm too busy to see my friends from Montana.
And you've been on the Eastern Wildlands Chapter Board, served on that, which we certainly appreciate. So.
Okay, thank you. Actually, they were good years. At some point, we'll talk about the Absaroka Beartooth area, and it's very interesting that I moved back to Billings. It was my home. My mother was still alive. I wanted to be near her. My wife is a gemologist. She needs a larger city. I might not have moved here otherwise, but I could take the measure of the environmental community in Montana. But what's really interesting is that, and it will be explained later, that the Beartooth part of the Absaroka Beartooths was in effect dropped. It was dropped on Billings like an overnight bomb so quickly that there was no time to gin up the opposition, because as a fairly conservative town with well, now it's extremely strong, but the motorized recreational sets that are very strong here, it happened so quickly that the opposition couldn't gin up.
Telephone, Teddy, do you have the phone there?
Marcy?